Alright, in this video, I am going to show you how I developed a custom completion source for Neovim, and specifically for nvim-compe, the very popular completion plugin. I had a specific use case where I needed GraphQL schema completion, and I'll explain why. But this video is not about GraphQL, it's about creating custom completion sources. And so you may have some things that you would like to have completion for. In order to use the code that will be provided on the What's That Smell repository for the code in this video, then you will need to be using nvim-compe. A lot of this knowledge transfers to any completion engine that you want to extend, but specifically targeting nvim-compe because it's the most popular and most highly recommended currently in the Neovim community for completion. That could change, but either way, these skills are going to be useful for you. I needed to have GraphQL schema completion. And by that I mean I wanted the fields and other GraphQL symbols to be auto-completed when I start to type them in my source file. If you're using TypeScript, you may already get this. For me, I work on several GraphQL projects and we use JavaScript. Automatically with Compe, I have buffer word completion, and so if my resolver happens to be in the same file as the GraphQL schema symbol, then it'll show up as a buffer word, but I wouldn't know the difference by looking at the completion whether it was a part of the schema. What do you need to do to get started and build your custom completion source? All right, well, in my case, I need my GraphQL schema. Now, I work on several GraphQL projects, but luckily the schema is federated. That's very convenient for me here because I really just need one source. You may be using something other than Apollo. Rover is Apollo's latest CLI written in Rust. I think you're obligated to say that. Whenever anything's written in Rust, you have to say it's written in Rust. But they did that so they would have stability and better performance as opposed to the original Apollo CLI. So it's still in beta as of the timing for this video. If you're not using Apollo and you have something else, either way, you need to run an introspection query against your graph, get it to dump the results of the introspection query. I've already run it. And if you're building something that isn't a GraphQL schema completion source, you're doing something else, then however you want to get the source, then grab what you need. So maybe you want some other items from the internet or from your system, and you want to complete those things. So you'll need to either go get them and build a file and go through and parse that file and output something that can be consumed as a Compe completion source, or within your Lua file, run whatever zish commands or anything else you want to do to get what you need and pull it in and transform it. Now, this zish script, as I said, could be essentially put into the Lua file, but I have it out separate right now, and I create a file and then we'll read that file into Vim. If we take a look here, I'm using ripgrep and some regex, and then I'm going through and I'm cutting and awking and cutting and awking and awking and sorting and cutting and then dumping it to a file. There's probably a better way, but I was trying to be very clear and have each piece of the pipeline doing one thing that I could understand. It's been cut down already, but obviously I could go through and do the whole thing, probably with awk, and originally I was testing it by dumping it out to FZF and seeing what I was getting, and then in the end, when I got what I liked, this was then dumped to a text file instead of FCF. And so I'm not going to show you my GraphQL schema, but basically it dumps out all of your types and fields and comments and everything, and it's definitely parsable. But what you need for a completion source is a list of words, preferably not white space and not blank lines and things like that. And you could also use tab delimited file and that sort of thing, because you can parse that obviously with Lua. All I really wanted here was just a list of all of the fields and all of the user-defined types that are in my schema, so that I can get those items and know when something is a schema item and when it's just text. And we'll look at that. This here goes and finds any words that end in a colon or an opening parentheses. And then when it finds it, it cuts it off at the delimiter and then goes through and does basically the same thing again with awk, but this time for the ones that use an opening paren, which I couldn't do with cut. And so that's why I went back and forth there. And obviously going to put this up in the repo at the end of the video, and if you want to put in a pull request that makes this script better, please do. I'm probably going to tinker with it, but then you can see here, then I go and I cut again, this time with the quotes, because I want to get rid of any comments that are in this file, because I'm looking to just have a nice list of words. And then I'm removing white space, and then I'm removing empty lines, then I'm sorting the words, and then I'm cutting the space between words. So 2 of the words that show up out of the hundreds are technically not schema symbols, but I can live with that. This just cuts those off at the space between the words and then dumps it out to the source text file that I've created. Let's take a look at my compe settings here. Now, all of this is, I believe, the default. You can see that I've added the Zish completion, and I've added my GQL schema completion. This is one piece that when we go look at the documentation for this, that doesn't get mentioned, but that you need to do. And then if you run Packer and you then remove these or comment them out, you'll still have the completion source until the next time you run Packer. The last piece will be to add this GraphQL schema source to compe. Now we won't start here. This is where we'll start, but first let's look at some of the documentation here. Here is the nvim-compe repo, and here you can see you have your Vim script version of configuration and your Lua. Setting up compe, there is plenty of information on that. It's pretty straightforward, and that's not what this video is about. You can also look at my dot files, which are linked in the description. You can start from there if you would like to do that. Here in the wiki, we have creating a source, and they go through and tell you what you need to do in order to create a source of your own, a custom source. Well, good. That's great. And you have a Vim script example, and you have a Lua example. One of the things about these examples is that they're very helpful, and usually the example is not something super real world, but it's a good starting point. But here you get a nice piece of Lua source code and you can dump it in a file, but it assumes that you know where to put this file and how to reference the file, and also how, when Neovim loads up and compe loads up, how to actually have the timing right so that your source is registered and usable. So I'll show you that. Also, you might want these hard-coded values for completion, but generally you want something more dynamic. You're already going to have the months as a completion if you turn spelling on, and so you probably know your months and probably don't need extra context. As I mentioned with the GraphQL schema, if I don't have context in the completion of what it is, I don't know if it's a symbol potentially from something else that isn't being parsed, or if it's in a comment. So I need it to tell me, hey, no, I'm a GraphQL schema symbol. I'm not just a word in a comment. And so here you have these months. So if it was important to you, months probably not, because it's going to be obvious from spelling. You can add whatever you want to your spell files in Neovim. Then those will be auto-completed for you if you use the spell completion, and you won't have to worry about a separate completion. But for whatever reason you may not want to have spelling on and you want months, then you could just plop this in and do a couple things we're going to do. There you'll have auto-completed words. If you want these to be identified as anything, kind of special, or have, different nerd font symbol or something like that, then you can use the kind field for these tables and call it a month, or maybe just put a little calendar icon. And then the last part of the completion, when you look at it, and we'll look at it again, is that you'll see the source at the end. And so in this case, it would say my custom source at the end, but you could change that to say months or whatever you want. And then you'll have context there. You don't have to provide this documentation. The documentation is what you see when you're actually walking through the completion items. The little pop out that comes out to the side will show whatever you have here for documentation. And so if you don't put anything, though, then there just won't be any extra documentation. There's enough in your drop down list that you don't need every single item to have even more context, but you can. And you can do a special function like this for documentation. You also have some other options. Then the important thing is to register your source at the end here. Now, of course, I'm looking at the Vim script one. That's nice, but we're going to do this in Lua. Same patterns, it's just a little bit different syntax. These are hard-coded words right in the source file. We want something dynamic, or at least semi-dynamic. We're going to read it in and use it on demand. And so same idea here, register your source. And then here are some other examples of custom completions, and it was helpful for me to look through some of these to see what they did in order to truly get this going, because you can't just drop this file in and go. There's some things you need to hook up and things that you'll need to change and do. And one that isn't listed there, there may be more, is the Zish completion. It's really nice, and in this case they have a full-blown plugin here. So you drop this in, you set Zish to true in your compe configuration. One of the things that they do in this particular code base is that the Zish commands to go and get the Zish completion stuff is done in Lua, and you can check that out on your own. You can see here, this is what we are going to end up with, the completion, and things are identified as GraphQL schema items. That's nice, as opposed to just a buffer word or whatever else. So I know, okay, this is a schema item, so I can use it to complete. And it's also a good sanity check. Am I using the right thing? Or when you look at these here, is personal use, and maybe I don't remember, was it is private use? Whatever, you just start typing ISP. Okay, yeah, personal use. Okay, that's the one I want when I'm writing a resolver. That's a GraphQL specific thing. If you want to get my dot files, they are here in what's that smell dots. And I mentioned earlier about the Rover CLI, and that's bright. This is where you can get that if you happen to be doing GraphQL here, but again, that's not required. It just happens to be the example that we are using. So now let's take a look at the actual code on getting this up and running. One thing the documentation and example does not show you out in the Compe wiki is that you need to wait until Compe is loaded, then require your actual Compe source file. And here, this G loaded Compe is a global variable set by Compe, and you can see that here, that we look to see if that's there. And the has nvim is nice to do in general because not everybody's using Neovim, but the thing is, if you're not using Neovim, then you're not using Compe with much luck. This is going to go in your after plugin folder. You needed to go in your after folder in your Vim runtime path because you want this particular Vim file to be sourced after the other things are loaded. That's why it's called after. And this is the one piece that is done in a Vim file as opposed to a Lua file. And I know there are some PRs in flight for being able to do more of this sort of thing in Lua. In fact, there might be some pieces available. As far as I know, this is the way to definitely get it to work. This is the way the other plugins do it, and the way you would do this in general, where you need to make sure something else is loaded, like a plugin, before you go and add your extension to it. Then we get to check out some Lua code here, and this is the whole entire thing here. This is the source file for the custom source completion, and this started off as copy pasta of that month example from the Compe wiki, and then I went through and made it my own by doing what developers do, looking at examples of how other people have done it, and then making changes to suit my needs. I'm sure that one person did it this way, and the next person followed, That's not necessarily always the best practice and best pattern for things, but that tends to be what happens. We won't go into all the Lua. You can look this stuff up, and again, this was copy pasted from the example. There, it's creating a new source and returning the function to set the meta table. And here is the get metadata function, and this is pretty self-explanatory. You want to get the metadata. You can mess around with the priorities so that you can determine whether your source is going to kind of outrank another source where the particular items match. You can change this to GraphQL Schema, which is what I did, but you can change it to whatever source you are creating. And then I call any to-dos in my Lua files to-doas. Here I have the file types. I have a variable here, a global variable called compe gql fts, which is the file type. So this is something that I could set out in my init Lua, but if this variable is not set, then use GraphQL file types and JavaScript file types by default, but don't show this stuff in Markdown and other places. For work, most of my projects are GraphQL projects, and they have the federated schema. So basically I want this in all my projects, and it's the same schema. One thing that would be nice here is for me to check that I'm actually in a GraphQL related repo, and then if I am, then down below when we get there, then get the schema that I want. And if I'm doing some other JavaScript project, like for personal use and for open source, I have some other ones and a couple at work that are not GraphQL, but that are RESTful services and things like that. And I don't want this GraphQL schema completion in there because that's just noise and it's not relevant to what I'm doing. And so having a check for that would be good. And there's any number of ways to check. Another to-do here is to call the zish command that you saw earlier and generate this comp file on demand. Then here, the other possibility would be to not use zish and use Lua and suck in the schema file and use Lua to go and parse it and create the source I need right on the fly. And so no intermediate file needs to be created. So it's kind of two parts. I can run the zish commands from within this Lua file to create the file that I need, or not use zish at all and just go grab the schema file, and instead of doing all those cuts and awks and everything else, use Lua to do it. So that's another possibility, and feel free to put in a PR if you want to do that. And then there's also the idea of calling a rover or whatever you use to get your results from introspection. And that's something that can be set up. I mean, you could say what executable do you want to use and what command do you want to use and have that be a setting, and then have it dump the file where you want it. That might be a little bit of overkill. And then making the file path a variable and checking for it. That's obviously not ideal. And if you were to take the source code down right now, you would need to go in and manually change that to where you have your file. That should definitely be something that the user can set if this were a plugin. I mean, this is for my personal use. I'm going to share it and then probably change it to a plugin. All right, so as I said, the first thing you want to do is go out and get your schema and dump it to a file. I dumped it to a .graphql extension file. It can be whatever text file. And then the next thing you do is, of course, run that zish file that we saw, and that'll be in the repo, and then change the file path below to the file that gets spit out. And then here I'm just saying that I plan to automate all of this other than the grabbing of the schema through introspection. Here is the source complete function. The first thing is that instead of having hard-coded months, I wanted to pull my items from somewhere. Now, here's the part where you could execute commands such as, zish commands, or move all that here into Lua and just use Lua to wrap the zish functions and put it all right here in your Lua file. And if you look at the compe zish completion code base, you'll see that they do that. Just call zish from within Lua and get the information out and go from there. Or you can just use Lua and just pull in the file and not use awk and all that other stuff, and just use utilities in Lua to parse the file. What I wanted was to go through my file line by line and get the word on each line, and it's already all nice and cleaned up for me from the zish function. Each line I'm going to insert into this items table, which, as you saw in the example, contained the months hard-coded, but we're generating this table in this loop here as we go through each line. And so I'm setting the value of word to the value of line, and then this kind is this extra piece of information that goes before the actual menu value, which in this case is GQL schema. So I just put a little rocket there because we've associated rockets with GraphQL, mostly because of Apollo. The critical part here is making sure in the callback that you set items to items. That is going to load up each word from each line. That's exactly what we want. It would be smart to check that this file exists, then go through it. Okay, and then here you have the very critical piece of registering your source. So remember, you were requiring the source here, but you need to register the source, and then compe will use it. So if we go here, you can see that the last thing you have to do is set GraphQL Schema to true. Then you will get completion in your JavaScript files. All right, and then one of the important things to know here is about the complete items and what's available to you. And then all of this will make sense because this is what is getting used here. So if you go to complete items and over here in Telescope, of course you can read it all without even opening it, but we'll go ahead and open it, and you can see that we have the word, and you'll note that up here we had the word that we're setting, and that's what this word is here. And then you have the ability to put an abbreviation in. The menu is what you saw as the metadata, and that gets displayed after the word or the abbreviation. Let's take a look at a JavaScript file. So this is just a plain old JavaScript file. I want to start getting completion. Well, I hit the letter A, and you can see that I have all of these GraphQL schema completions, and these are all the words from my schema that I generated and parsed. And you can see that the word attention is in the buffer right above. If I was in one of the files that has GraphQL schema in it within the template literal and comments and other things, I would get any words that are in there, but they would all show up as these buffer words and then mixed in with LSP stuff, but not the GraphQL template literals. That's what I needed. I wouldn't know if this word active was just in a comment or if it was actually a schema symbol. So now I do. This is really great. It gives me that context. And then of course this is just an item in the buffer. All of this is going to be up on the repo, and you can pull it down or put in pull requests for that and make your own custom completion source for Compe, and the sky's the limit with what you can do there. And it's straightforward, and now you have all the pieces. Please feel free to put in a pull request. Now that I have this list of words from my schema, I can use this in FCF or Telescope, and if I add a little context, I can pull up my GraphQL schema in Telescope, and because, as I mentioned, I have these typedef files all over various projects, I can select the GraphQL symbol from my schema in Telescope and then tell Telescope to go grep that string, and that will take me to the typedef file, because I'm always looking for where is this defined, and that to me sounds like something that would have to be an extension. So that might be something I'll build in a future video. Well, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe and comment, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.